So I saw a very interesting theory on the Borderlands 4 subreddit where this person theorized that there would be a new prismatic damage type coming to Borderlands 4, and this theory directly comes from a piece of gameplay we got to look at, which was one of the Vault Hunter's action skills. And this Vault Hunter seems to be the smallest Vault Hunter, the lady that looks like she could be a Maliwan soldier because her leg piece looks like it's one of the Maliwan soldier's leg pieces with all the tubes running through it. And when she uses her action skill, she pulls out what looks to be the kind of front side of a mech you would get into, but instead of actually getting fully into a mech, she just shoots out this massive ball. It's this multicolored ball in the middle, and then it kind of has what looks like almost like a barrier all around it as another circle, but she shoots it at this big enemy and it changes him to kind of have a rainbow effect on him. Now, after this ball goes straight through him, it keeps going and then blows up into what looks to be kind of like a nuke, kind of like Roland's nuke effect. But the very interesting part about that is that it looks like she put a rainbow debuff on this character, which most people kind of instantly thought that it would be an effect that has maybe all of the negative effects that you could get from different weapons, like burn, slag from previous games, poison, all of those effects. And maybe it was something like that, or could be some other effect that kind of ties in a lot of the elements. And that would also make sense as being kind of a Maliwan soldier. Maliwan is kind of the manufacturer that has the most elemental damage types on their weapons. So it would make sense that she kind of has this mastery over all of these different elements and can use an action skill to apply them all to enemies that are hit by it. They also go further with this theory and tie in some of the legendary weapon drops we got to see in one of the trailers as well. Because in one of the trailers, we got to see a big loot explosion, probably from defeating a boss, and every legendary we got to see at that point not only had the normal legendary beam, but it also had these kind of multicolored rainbow sparkle effects, and then some of them, or all of them, it was a bit hard to tell, also had this kind of rainbow helix circling around the normal legendary beam. And not only did we get to see these legendaries, this kind of rainbow sparkle effect, but in the most recent gameplay trailer, we also got to see a legendary weapon that did not have that sparkle effect. It was just a normal legendary without anything extra on its legendary beam. So it seems like there is some type of different legendary items that are all augmented with this kind of rainbow effect. Now, we've obviously seen this before. We had anointments in Borderlands 3. Hopefully it's not like anointments. They are theorizing that this kind of a prismatic effect could also tie into the different roles we could get on legendary items. And I do think this is an interesting theory, but I don't necessarily think these rainbow particle effects from the legendary weapons are the same thing as the effect that was put on this enemy from this Vault Hunter's action skill. I don't think you would be getting a special roll of any legendary, and it now just has this prismatic effect that like applies a bunch of different elements or a bunch of different effects to an enemy. Now, I do think it's a higher possibility that this prismatic effect on the legendary weapon drops, instead of giving you all of the effects, maybe adds like one additional effect to your weapon and maybe ties in different ways depending on what type of weapon that is. That could actually make these augmented drops much more interesting than anointeds from Borderlands 3, which is something I don't think anybody wants. I don't think anybody wants a super boring additional version of a legendary that just gives you hundreds of % of damage increase. Pretty much makes every normal legendary completely useless. Adding a different elemental effect or some type of possible debuff to a legendary weapon that can tie in different ways to different weapons could be quite interesting and could tie a bit back into kind of the prismatic effect. Like now you could have these legendary weapons where maybe one was fire before, maybe now it's like fire with a chance to also poison off your fire, or maybe this legendary weapon never had an effect, but now it has a chance to poison off of headshots or something. Not only would it make these additional augmented drops much more interesting than anointments, it would also allow a bunch of different versions of a bunch of different weapons that you could fit into different builds much more easily. Because I do think one of the more restraining elements of build crafting in the Borderlands games has been trying to sometimes match up different status effects or make sure you have the multiple different status effects you want in your build. Now, if they had these different legendary drops you could get that are rare versions, but they just add these different elemental effects to different weapons and do it in different ways, this could allow you to use one weapon when you get the augmented version, if you get the correct roll, in a build that you can never use it in before. Like maybe you're using a build that you do increased damage to enemies on fire or something, but let's say the main weapons you're using are not fire weapons, so you have to maybe use a weapon that has fire on it that you don't really want to use, that you just have to catch people on fire and then switch weapons. Well, maybe now one of the main weapons you're using in your build that you want to be using now has a chance to have a fire augmented roll on it, to where you do something specific with it. Maybe a certain time after you use your action skill, it catches enemies on fire. That could completely change up the weapons you're actually using in your build, either allowing you to match elements more easily or allowing you to get different elemental effects that you weren't able to have before in your build. These augmented legendary drops could potentially also have a bunch of different elements on them, but then you do different things with that weapon and it kind of switches elements. I do think something like that would be interesting, but I think be a lot more annoying in the long run. Like let's say every legendary weapon that had that augment on it could have multiple different elements on it, but maybe this one you have to reload it and switches elements. Maybe this one you get a kill and it switches elements. Stuff like that can be interesting, but it generally becomes annoying when you add it on too many things. So I'm hoping that's not the case. It could also just be that it is nothing like this and that's just the effect they chose to put on this, and it could be something completely different. It could just be returning anointments, which I hope it's not. It's probably not going to be that. Or it could just be any other type of augmented rolls on legendary items. Now, I do think that this character having this rainbow debuff effect they could put on enemies makes me want to play this character first, because I do really like the idea of being able to build into being the kind of rainbow class, meaning that you just have all of the different elemental debuffs you can put on enemies. Because I did some similar builds in Borderlands 3 where playing Amara and having different elemental effects you could apply to enemies, and then having different weapons that could easily apply more effects. You could have almost all of the effects or even all of the different debuffs you could have in the game and use it in one build. It was definitely a bit harder to pull that off and maybe not the strongest it could possibly be, but having a character that's kind of built around that, seemingly also being an ex-Maliwan soldier, is definitely something that, if that's the case, will probably be what I'm playing first, because I really like the idea of that. Being focused on those kind of negative effects you can put on enemies, doing all of these different damage types, and then also being able to kind of put any weapon that has an elemental effect into that build. It just is really interesting to me, and I think allows for many different build possibilities. So I am looking forward to seeing what these different roles on these legendaries end up being, and I'm very excited to see what type of debuff this character is putting on this enemy, and seeing if it really is just all these different negative effects put on an enemy at once, which would be really cool to me. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.